Today we're going to be looking at wrestlers who seem like they were born at the wrong time and, as such, have missed out on being a part of the generation they were best suited to. Yes, sometimes it feels like certain performers were just meant for a different era, but who are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into Out of Time, Wrestlers in the Wrong Era, Part 2. And if we're going to start anywhere, let's do so with someone who's only just getting their start in the industry right now. That said, for as much as Von Wagner is finding success over on current-day NXT, it seems like he'd have a much easier time of it in the Golden Era. Why is that? Well, because he's very much an 80s style of wrestler, someone whose defining characteristics are that he's big and muscular. On top of that, he has a promo style which is ripped straight out of the Vince McMahon playbook, short, blunt, and full of cheap heat. Sure, it may sound like we're making fun of Von Wagner here, but we're not, because if he was around during the Golden Era, these would have been the exact qualities which made him a star. And for that reason then, we can easily imagine him working out great during that time period as both a babyface and a heel, maybe someone who starts out as Hulk Hogan's new friend of the month, only for him to later turn on the champ and demand a title shot. Yes, it's unlikely he ever would have won the world title, even back then, but let's be honest, there were plenty of stars who never got to taste the gold while Terry Bollea had a stranglehold over it. And even if he hadn't won the top prize, Von Wagner could have at least made a great undercard champion at some point, maybe even in the tag team division. But then why wouldn't he? After all, tag team wrestling is in his blood, as his dad is actually Wayne Bloom, someone better known to most wrestling fans as Bo Beverly, one half of the Beverly Brothers. That's right, if Von Wagner was able to get access to a time machine and go back to the Golden Era, he might even be able to partner up with his father as the third part of the trio, a role which would suit him perfectly. Of course, not everyone who's best suited to being a part of the Golden Era would have the luxury of going back to work with a parent though, but even with that said, it's still hard to imagine Chris Masters not excelling there. Why is that? Well, this one should be obvious. After all, Masters' entire gimmick was based around the fact he had big muscles and a submission finisher which no one could escape from. So with this in mind then, it's not hard to imagine him breaking out during a period when bigger was perceived as better. Hell, we can picture it in our mind's eye right now in fact. The masterpiece gets introduced with a series of vignettes proclaiming him to be the strongest man in the world, someone who's coming to WWF to show everyone what a real man is. Then when he arrives after that, he starts carrying out the Master Lock Challenge on a series of jobbers, all before working his way up to a true main eventer like Hulk Hogan or the Ultimate Warrior. Yes, this is pretty much note for note what he did during the Ruthless Aggression era, but it would have been so much more effective overall if it had happened a couple of decades prior. In fact, we can even see a timeline where, after challenging the Hulkster, Masters managed to get a victory over him, possibly even winning the world title in the process, in order to set up a big WrestleMania main event rematch. And if you think that sounds too far-fetched, need we remind you that Sid main evented WrestleMania twice, the second of which saw him come in as WWF champion? So really, there's no reason why Chris Masters couldn't have done the same, just as there's no reason our next subject couldn't have succeeded at the height of the Golden Era. After all, superstar Billy Graham was pretty much the prototype for the whole thing anyway. Yes, while he may have hit his peak as a performer during the days of Vince McMahon Sr., in truth, Billy Graham was actually the inspiration for much of what the Golden Era would become. Take his look, for example, muscular beyond belief, and with more of a focus on letting his charisma shine via promos. With that in mind then, you could make an argument that without him, there would be no boom period in the 80s. Hell, figures like Hulk Hogan and Jesse the Body Ventura have gone on record as saying they pretty much ripped off their characters wholesale from Graham. And even the idea of calling his performers superstars rather than wrestlers was something Vince McMahon Jr. got from the former WWF champion. So can you imagine how great he would have been had he just come around a decade later then, and was able to reap the rewards of everything he helped to pave the way for? If nothing else, the promo battles between him and the Hulkster would have been nothing short of era-defining. And it's not just Hogan he'd have a great feud with. No, what if the superstar got to share the ring with the likes of Macho Man Randy Savage, Rowdy Roddy Piper, and the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase? Seriously, there's no end to the classic moments he could have created. And to be honest, he'd probably work even better as a world champion here than he did in the 70s. Sadly though, due to a falling out with management around this time, Graham would never get the chance to be around while Hulkamania was running wild, outside of a brief, poorly judged karate character that was. And this meant that he missed out on what would have surely been the biggest paychecks and highest exposure of his career. At least he was able to make amends with the company eventually though, something which finally allowed him to go into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2004. That said, when it comes to our next subject, it seems highly unlikely he'll ever have such a reconciliation with New York, but then maybe if he'd been around during the Attitude Era, things might have worked out differently for CM Punk. Yes, it's the man who's always in the wrestling news for one reason or another, and sure, he was a big deal during the PG era after he cut his famous pipe bomb promo, but can you imagine how much bigger he would have been than even that if he'd been around during the turn of the millennium? Hell, we can't really think of a better fit for the voice of the voiceless than to be placed right in the middle of the era where work shoots were the norm, and the edgier the character you had, the more over you would get. Just imagine the likes of Punk versus Steve Austin, Punk versus Mick Foley, or even Punk versus Triple H or The Rock while those two were still in their prime. The Austin program writes itself, of course, two iconoclasts, one straight edge and one hard drinking, going up against each other in a battle of not only ideologies, but of wills too. The promos alone would have been out of this world, and the matches themselves would have been nuclear in the heat they created. Honestly, if you think about it too much, it's enough to depress you, because we all know it will never happen. Still, we can dream about how well Punk would have fit in during this time period anyway, probably well enough to where he would have been one of the top stars the company had. But alas, by the time Pepsi Man came of age, the Attitude Era was well and truly over, and he was instead left with the task of trying to inject some excitement into a pretty lame late 2010s period, the very same period where our next subject was struggling to ply their craft too as it happened. That said, if Beth Phoenix had been around just a few years later in the modern era, she likely would have had a much easier time. And yes, we know Phoenix has made occasional appearances on screen over the last few years, usually with her husband Edge by her side, but these have always been cameos more than anything else, nothing compared to her real main run prior to that. Why was this run not as well suited to her talents? Well, back in the mid to late 2000s, WWE was very much getting into its Divas era, a period where the women on the roster were pushed more on their ability to look good in swimsuit magazines than anything else. Of course, the Glamazon was never this kind of performer though. No, she was someone who always wanted to be taken seriously, and that's exactly why she focused on being a great in-ring wrestler above all else. Sure, this did allow her to find some success during her heyday, but it was always with the caveat that she was never going to be as important as people like Kelly Kelly or Candice Michelle. Had Phoenix entered the industry a few decades later though, it would have been an entirely different world, as there, she would have fit right in with the temperature of the day. After all, this was the point where folks like Sasha Banks, Charlotte Flair, and Paige, just to name a few, were changing the game for women in New York. And the way they were doing this was by having excellent athletic matches each and every week. Matches which focused more on their technique and wrestling skills than how good they looked in a bikini. So place the Glamazon in the middle of this situation then, and she'd have surely thrived as the resident powerhouse of the division. Someone who could play the big bully to performers such as Io Sky, Becky Lynch, or Bayley. But it wouldn't just be smaller women Beth would excel against, because the idea of her fighting 2023 Rhea Ripley already has us salivating. Just as the idea of her going up against someone like Ronda Rousey or Asuka seems like a dream for modern-day women's wrestling fans. And she's not the only woman from a prior time who would be a much better fit in the modern era. No, while she was successful as a multiple-time Divas champion during the late 2000s and early 2010s, Michelle McCool could have been so much more if she'd been around just a few years later. Yes, if the Florida native was able to shine to her full potential, she'd always have been putting on in-ring classics. Don't believe us? Just go back and take a look at some of the matches she had during the latter part of her run. You'll see that McCool was able to give us a better in-ring product than most of the women on the roster. And when it came to her character work, particularly whenever she was paired up with her late cool teammate Layla, well, that was pretty much the prototype for what the Iconics would later become. So with this in mind, it's easy to imagine McCool managing to get over in the modern day as someone who can handle herself on the mic during promo battles with the likes of Becky Lynch, all while keeping up in the ring with Charlotte Flair or Bayley whenever the time called for it. Hell, we've even gotten a few tasters of this over the last couple of years, as in the 2018, 2022, and 2023 Women's Royal Rumbles, she made cameo appearances and actually had a pretty decent showing each time. During the former appearance, in fact, McCool actually eliminated 5 people. Then, when she returned 4 years later, she was able to remain in the ring for a full 20 minutes, proving she wasn't out of her depth with all the younger talent around her. That said, given she and her husband The Undertaker have now settled into family life, at this point a full-time return to the ring seems unlikely. So we'll just have to be happy with the little snippets of her we get going forward then. But at least we'll still have those little snippets at all, which is far more than can be said for our next subject, because after tragically dying way too young at just 35 years old, Brian Pillman missed out on the Attitude Era by a matter of mere months. What a crime that was then, because the loose cannon would have fit right into the WWF's new phase perfectly. Hell, he was basically playing an Attitude Era character already in the mid-90s, one who was breaking new ground everywhere he went with his "is this real or is it fake" character. Need any evidence we're telling the truth? Just look at how he was able to work everyone, wrestlers and fans alike, during his latter days with WCW. When he got people so confused as to what was going on, Eric Bischoff at one point gave him a legitimate release from his contract in order to sell an angle. And when he took this release, then jumped right over to New York, Pillman took his gimmick even further when he infamously pulled out a gun on live TV during an episode of Raw in November of 1996. So if he'd been able to carry that over to 1998, the possibilities would have been endless for what he could have achieved. Of course, there would have been the natural program between him and his former Hollywood Blondes teammate Steve Austin, but even once that was over, there was plenty left to mine. Just think of how great a Brian Pillman versus Triple H feud would have been, or for that matter, Brian Pillman versus The Rock. And then there's the kind of chaos he could have created with the likes of Mick Foley, The Undertaker, or Kane, had he just been given a little more time. Yes, due to his motorcycle accident, he wasn't going to be putting on any 5-star classics anymore, but the Attitude Era was never really about great bouts anyway, for the most part. No, it was always more about the characters and promos. And few, if any, would have been able to shine brighter in this environment than the loose cannon. Who knows how far he could have taken his breaking the fourth wall gimmick, maybe all the way into the mainstream. Just imagine Pillman appearing on something like TRL or David Letterman at this time, and going buck wild, much to the confusion of everyone around him. Of course, when it comes to our next subject though, well, he was never that exciting of a promo. No, his skills always came more in the form of his in-ring work, which is exactly why Dean Malenko would have likely flourished during the Ruthless Aggression era. That's right, the man of 1,000 holds never really got his full due during the turn of the millennium, as, with so many other memorable characters around him, it became difficult for the New Jersey native to stand out. Hell, even in his own stable, he was often seen as at least the third most important member when placed next to Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit. Had he been around a few years later, however, such a thing may not have been a problem, because once the Ruthless Aggression era came along, the focus quickly shifted towards a product which was far more interested in great wrestling. And that's evident in some of the names who served as the bigger stars of the era, names like Kurt Angle, Brock Lesnar, and Rey Mysterio. Just imagine then how much more longevity Malenko could have added to his career if he'd gotten to mix it up with even one of these performers. And if that wasn't possible for one reason or another, he could have still had bangers on the mid-card going up against people such as Shelton Benjamin, Rob Van Dam, and Chavo Guerrero. Unfortunately though, all this will have to remain a what-if, as in 2001, right as a new era was dawning, Dean decided that it was time to hang up his boots for good. Sure, he would still appear on TV in the occasional backstage segment, and he would also work as a match producer behind the scenes with WWE for some time, but as for his time in the ring, this was well and truly over. Maybe he could make a late life return though, we hear some of you say. Well, sure. The Ruthless Aggression era might be over now, but there are still plenty of great technical wrestlers in the modern day he could go up against. Well, that's not gonna happen either, unfortunately, because since the late 2010s, Dean has been battling Parkinson's disease, meaning the chances any doctor would ever clear him for a match again are 0 to 0. Still, with him now being a producer for AEW, he can at least get the opportunity to sit back and watch some modern-day legends do their thing. And of the style Malenko likely enjoys most, perhaps no one would seem more appealing to him than Claudio Castagnoli. That said, for as much as the Swiss Superman is currently tearing it up as a member of the Blackpool Combat Club, we can't help but wonder if he also wouldn't have been better suited long-term to being a part of the Ruthless Aggression era. Why is that? Well, like with Dean Malenko, Castagnoli's primary focus has always been on being a great wrestler above all else. And this is why he'd spend years honing his skills across indie promotions such as Chikara, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, and Ring of Honor before he even made it to WWE in 2011. Sadly though, doing this also meant he'd miss out on the Ruthless Aggression era that company had, resulting in him never getting a chance to lock up with some of the all-time greats who were working in New York then. Yes, in a cruel twist of fate, fans would never get to see the likes of Claudio vs. Kurt Angle because while their careers did cross over somewhat, they were always in separate companies. So because of this, by the time he did show up in WWE, it was the PG era already, a period where it was more about bland creator wrestlers than anything else. And that meant the former Cesaro's talents would largely go to waste, as rather than being pushed like fans wanted, he would serve a role as a perennial mid-card act, one who often worked in tag teams alongside the likes of Jack Swagger, Tyson Kidd, and Sheamus. Still, at least it's not all bad for the Swiss Superman because, as we mentioned a moment ago, he's since jumped ship over to AEW where he's become a member of the Blackpool Combat Club, with him there regularly getting to work matches alongside the likes of Jon Moxley, Bryan Danielson, and Wheeler Yuta. On top of that, he's also the current Ring of Honor World Champion, a run which has allowed him to prove he really can be the face of a division if he's given the ball to run with. But not everyone gets the luxury of having a second chance, unfortunately. No, sometimes when a performer, or pair of performers, fails, you rarely hear their names again. That said, given the era they came up in, the Vaudevillains were always destined to fall flat, and that's exactly why they would have been a better fit for the New Generation era. That's right, while Simon Gotch and Aiden English had some degree of success during their time working for WWE in the mid-2010s, it was pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. In fact, the thing they're most remembered for now has nothing to do with their partnership, as many people know English instead from a period serving as Rusev's herald in 2017 and 2018. How different things could have been, though, had the pair joined Vince McMahon's promotion during the mid-90s instead, a period where silly gimmicks were the order of the day. Yes, the idea of the pair of vaudeville-era strongmen becoming pro wrestlers would have fit in perfectly if it was placed there alongside the likes of Mantar, Dr. Isaac Yankem, and Duke the Dumpster Droese. Hell, given the state of the tag team division at the time, what with it being mostly made up of jobber acts like the Smoking Guns, the Godwins, and Men on a Mission, we really wouldn't be surprised if the Vaudevillains had gotten multiple lengthy reigns with the gold back then. And had they gotten a chance to mix it up with some of the bigger teams such as the Steiner Brothers or the Harts, they may have even been able to put on a classic or two. In the end though, such a thing just wasn't meant to be, just as it wasn't meant to be for everyone else we've discussed today. But while that is sad, at least they can take solace in the fact they still got to perform on the big stage at all, even if it was ultimately in the wrong era.